I also want to ask you, the New York Times reporting about the refugee impact on the city of Lublin, Poland. That's about 135 miles from Lviv, Ukraine, where a hotel has taken in refugees. The manager is telling the Times, we have a whole army here, a network of hotel connections that works as a crisis team 24 hours a day, communicating fast with each other to check the availability of rooms and sending Ukrainians to one another. Such help requires a lot of money, but these are special situations. Listen, they even turned one of their conference rooms into a playroom for children from Ukrainian orphanages. The grassroots movement's incredible. It's also only a temporary solution. A hotel can't survive as a refugee center without assistance. What kind of assistance do they need?
Yeah, we, the International Rescue Committee, are using Lublin as our Polish hub. And there's an extraordinary effort, not just by the government, not just by commercial bodies like the hotel you mentioned, but also by ordinary families. And the most important lesson of experience from refugee crises around the world is that the sooner refugees can move into ordinary communities, living first of all with families, otherwise renting housing and being able to support themselves, the better. And the good news from the European side of the refugee crisis is that not only have 3 years of residency been guaranteed to any Ukrainian who arrives in Europe, but so has 3 years right to work, 3 years right to services, 3 years right to get your kids into school. And all of our experience shows that the sooner those measures for integration of refugees into the host community's life, the better. We don't want to see large refugee camps created. That's not going to be a way in which we're going to be able to meet the trauma that these refugees have faced and give them a sense of rebuilding a life before they can come to a view in the end about whether they can go back to Ukraine if and when peace is restored.
It's just so critical what you're saying, and I want to make sure that we underline it for our viewers, which is that there are plenty of people who are leaving, and their intent, their greatest wish may be to go back as quickly as possible, but there is simply the reality that people may be displaced for weeks, months, years, and their ability to live and work in these societies is absolutely critical. It is not lost on me, Mr. Miliband, that you said something very important there, which was the European side of this crisis, meaning that the U.S., I believe, also has a role to play. Of course, already temporary protected status, TPS, has been extended to Ukrainians who are already inside the United States, a large amount of aid. What more, though, does the United States need to be doing?
Well, Alicia, you're making a great point that obviously the US is fully engaged diplomatically, it's engaged militarily, but it can be engaged on the humanitarian side, not just the distribution of aid money, which is taking place from USAID led by Samantha Power, but also recognizing that this is a moment to reset global expectations of how to treat refugees. And there are those with Ukrainian links in the US who should be given the right to stay here, not just temporary protected status, but refugee status. And I'd also like to see this as an opportunity to extend the refugee resettlement program to Ukrainians so that they're given a chance to rebuild their lives here. The Biden administration has pledged to rebuild the refugee resettlement program, which historically had bipartisan support in the US. President Reagan admitted more refugees than any other American president. And that bipartisanship has been important, but it was absolutely trashed in the Trump years. President Biden and his team are trying to rebuild it. And this Ukraine crisis shows why it's so important, because there aren't just 2.5 million Ukrainian refugees today. There are over 30 million refugees and asylum seekers from other countries. And the US can continue to be, or can reestablish itself as a leader in refugee resettlement, which is important alongside the aid work that we've talked about.
It is the number one thing I hear from advocates, which is that the refugee cap here in the United States needs to be lifted and increased. I want to ask you before we go, very often when we talk about displacement across the globe, specifically when we talk about the crisis in Syria, we talk about this idea of a lost generation, right? This idea that there will be a generation of people who don't have more than a 4th grade education, that there will not be the community necessary to go back and rebuild their home country. We all, of course, see this as a humanitarian issue. This is also a geopolitical crisis. If this is not handled properly in real time, what are the future repercussions?
Well, I think you're making a really important point that untended humanitarian crises around the world are a source of political instability. But I'd also make another point. The Western world has said that liberal democracy is on the line. And one of the aspects of liberal democracy is to treat those in need properly. That's why this is a moral crisis as well as a military crisis, and it needs to be established properly.